So for the final video for this week, let's think about how the Episcopal Church moves increasingly towards activism, or at least how some members of the church move towards activism. So a hallmark here is in 1959, the establishment of the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity, also known as ESCRU, its acronym. And its goal is to create integration within the Episcopal Church. This group becomes very active in sit-in movements and uses pressure tactics to force Episcopal churches to desegregate. They're especially active in dioceses like Mississippi and Alabama. Bishop Carpenter of Alabama, referring to them, describes civil disobedience as just another name for lawlessness. And so referring back to this letter from the House of Bishops in 1958. What is the means by which the Episcopal Church will change? Will it change through its own internal canonical process, which we might see as a legal maneuvering, or will it change through activism, through pressure put on it, through entities like ESCRU, which we would talk about in more in terms of anti-racism or decolonization work. One famous ESCRU member is Sarah Patton Boyle, who comes from a prestigious Virginia Episcopalian family. And she is radicalized into really fully putting herself into the desegregation Southern freedom movement. And she writes about this process of transformation. And you read about some of this in an excerpt you have. And here she also reflects on her own still limited views on race relations. So I have an excerpt here I want to read. This is from page 243 from the anthology Freedom is a Dream by Cheryl Kajaba Holbrook. And so she says here, and we're using the terminology here that she composes in this time period, so the word Negro is being used. In addressing Negroes, my primary job was to make them see how we really felt about them. And my secondary job was to give them whatever aid and moral support they appeared to need. Now just note how that sounds very patronizing and paternalistic, which is this dynamic that Gardner Shattuck is also pointing to in his book, Episcopalians and Race. She goes on, in my efforts to do my primary job with Negroes, my motives were even more misunderstood than I realized at the time. In all my articles and speeches addressed to them, I stressed assurances, one, that they were not abhorred or regarded with contempt to the extent they thought, and two, that far from being singled out for such treatment, they were only one of many victims of a universal human yearning to feel superior. That is, white supremacy or any kind of supremacy happens everywhere, and in the United States, this burden falls on Black Americans. It would fall on other groups in other places. She goes on, my purpose in this, then, was clear-cut and single. I was trying to increase their sense of belonging, to undermine their unconscious fear that just maybe the loud voiced segregationists were right in their accusations of inferiority. But with hardly any exceptions, they interpreted my words as efforts to defend whites and worse, to belittle their own problems and burdens. I think this passage highlights well the problem that happens when a predominantly white institution and the white members of it take upon themselves the burden to resolve the problems and not to engage in some kind of meaningful collaborative work with the people for whom they're seeking freedom or liberation. And so Sarah Patton Boyle is directing the reader through her own process to say, we need to take into account the agency of African Americans in the Episcopal Church and in some ways let them take the lead and not assume that we can lead on our own. And this is an important insight for anyone who wants to continue to engage in anti-racist work. There are other Episcopalians in Southern contexts who are white leaders who continue to feel the call to work towards change. One is Duncan Gray, who later becomes the Bishop of Mississippi, who in 1962, he's a rector of St. Peter's, which is in downtown Oxford, Mississippi, which is right by the university. He and two faculty from there intervene in the rioting that's happened after the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. And I have you read his sermon that reflects from the next Sunday on the riot that's broken out all around their church, and to really ask the members of the parish to come to their own self-accounting, to take their own responsibility for the events that have occurred around them, and not to displace the blame onto outside agitators or onto the federal marshals who've been brought in to help quell unrest. And again, this is a significant move to be made here, which is to say this is not only about legal dynamics, but there's something in here about a Christian witness that one is being called towards. Issues really come to a head for the Episcopal Church within the Diocese of Alabama. And so I want to spend really the rest of this video focusing on the events of the Diocese of Alabama in 1963 through 1965. I think this is a crucible time for the life of the church. In 1963, the Alabama bishops, there was the bishop, George Murray, and the bishop coadjutor, Charles Carpenter. They signed a letter urging the governor, George Wallace, to accept federal orders to integrate. Violence breaks out in Birmingham around this, and those images are famous to you, of water hoses and police dogs. In response to this, presiding Bishop Arthur Lichtenberger denounces segregation and encourages all Episcopalians to support the civil rights movement. And he offered a Whit Sunday message to the church. Whit Sunday was the old name for Pentecost. And this is published in the New York Times. And following on this, presiding Bishop Arthur Lichtenberger and Executive Council coordinate an Episcopal presence in the March on Washington. In response, Bishop Carpenter of Alabama and Bishop Jones of Louisiana condemn the endorsement of the civil rights movement and say a better thing to do is to support the already existing black parishes in the South, which, by the way, Bishop Carpenter in Alabama was a great champion for the further development of these parishes. And he understands that's necessary for a gradualist approach to bring about change on the ground, versus Lichtenberger's emphasis on an interventionist approach. And this perspective of Carpenter, which is really the perspective of a white moderate, is part of the occasion for Martin Luther King Jr.'s composing of Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Because if you recall, King is responding to a letter by the religious leaders of Alabama to tell him to cease from his integration efforts, his civil disobedience efforts in Birmingham. And Bishop Carpenter is one of the people who has signed that letter. Bishop Carpenter is the white moderate King is talking about. In this context, in 1964, General Convention passes a resolution that moves into the canons, which we've read, affirming the unity of all people in baptism, and that no one could be denied equal standing in church, polity, or sacraments. So this is finally the passing of that resolution that failed in 1949. So 15 years later, it comes to pass. However, at the same convention, lay deputies refused to support a resolution supporting civil disobedience, whereas the clerical deputies had. And Thurgood Marshall is a representative to General Convention from the Diocese of New York as a lay deputy. And he leaves the convention in protest at this vote. At this same convention, Bishop John Hines is elected presiding bishop. And he declares that racial equality is his first priority. So a real marker is being put down here. We have Thurgood Marshall, soon to be a Supreme Court justice, leaving convention. We have John Hines from Texas, a diocese of the Confederacy, saying racial equality is the number one thing. And we have Bishop Carpenter saying, and the lay deputies saying, moderation is the way to go. So where is the Episcopal Church going to head? After General Convention, Executive Council issues instructions that no priest can work on issues of civil rights in Southern dioceses without permission from the local diocesan bishop. So this is an attempt to defang, as you would, the efforts of ESCRU in places like Alabama. And this comes out of Bishop John Allen of Mississippi voicing resistance to northern clergy affiliated with ESCRU coming to operate without his assent, even though Bishop John Allen is opposed to segregation, just like Bishop Carpenter is in the neighboring diocese. After a lot of protests, though, Executive Council reverses course, and the way is open for ESCRU members to return back to these dioceses. Things again come to a head in 1965. There is significant action happening in 1965 in that winter in Selma, Alabama. There's a significant effort to desegregate and to enroll voters. And while those civil actions are happening, on Sundays, ESCRU members attempt to integrate St. Paul's in Selma on a specific day in March. There is an interracial group that's blocked from entering St. Paul's in Selma by ushers on March 14th of 1965. Remember, the assault on the Edmund Pettus Bridge during the Selma to Montgomery March had happened the Sunday before on March 7th. And the second attempt is then made on March 20th to also integrate St. Paul's. And on that day, Bishop Kim Myers, who's a suffragan bishop of Michigan, leads the second effort to integrate with 200 people. Police block them from approaching St. Paul's, and this interaction is captured by national news media. So what happens instead is that Eucharist is celebrated outside of Brown Chapel, the African Methodist Episcopal Church nearby, which had been the center point for civil rights organizing around the Selma action. If you go to the Episcopal Church Archives exhibit on African American history in the Episcopal Church, if you go under the ESCRU page, you can find a link to an Episcopal News Service radio piece about this confrontation between Bishop Kim Myers and the sheriff who had been deputized to take care of this incident. So we have this conflict now building around integration of specific places and spaces. As I mentioned before, on March 21st is the Selma March across the Pettus Bridge. Among those who march, so many people marched on that day, but included in that is Bishop John Hines as presiding bishop, and 500 Episcopalians, including, the estimate is, about 10% of all active Episcopal clergy members marched across the bridge that day. Bishop Carpenter stayed away, and he asked all of his clergy from the diocese to stay home, and he called the march a foolish business and a waste of time. Now, all along in this period of time, Bishop Carpenter and Murray instruct St. Paul's to integrate. Jonathan Daniels, who was a seminarian at Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was active as an ESCRU member there, and he and other ESCRU members, including Judith Upham, lead an interracial group to the Church of St. Paul's, and he writes a letter complaining to Bishop Carpenter about his bad treatment at St. Paul's. So the St. Paul's vestry was still reluctant to let people in who were seeking to integrate the church. Jonathan Daniels chooses not to return back to the fall semester at Episcopal Theological School. Instead, he decides to stay on as an organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by Stokely Carmichael, to do organizing in Lowndes County in particular, outside of Selma. This was a very difficult area to be active in, with constant threats of violence. He is killed after being released from jail in Hayneville, Alabama, having been arrested in Fort Depot or Fort Deposit in nearby. And as he's released from jail, he's walking with Ruby Sales, Roman Catholic priest Richard Morrisroe, and Joyce Bailey, who, along with Ruby Sales, is another female African-American organizer for SNCC. And they are shot. They're threatened outside of Verner's Cash store. Ruby Sales' life is threatened with the assailant Tom Coleman, who is a licensed deputy wielding a shotgun. Jonathan Daniels pulls Ruby Sales out of the way. He takes a shotgun blast and is killed. Richard Morrisroe, the Roman Catholic priest, runs away with Joyce Bailey. Richard Morrisroe is also shot and wounded. Jonathan Daniel dies. You can watch the video with the interview with Ruby Sales that really puts all this into stark relief. Bishop Murray notes that Jonathan Daniels' death at least was partly due because of the use of civil disobedience. At the 1966 Diocesan Convention for Alabama, Bishop Murray urges that all, quote, unwanted interlopers, unquote, return home. Jonathan Daniels would have been one of those unwanted interlopers. So Daniels' death really underlines a question here of, are we talking about the integration of society and the churches, of getting of rights, or are we seeing that effort as nesting within a larger question of freedom itself, of a decolonizing process that is liberative for the entirety of a human person, that is really fundamentally about human dignity? The access to a voting place or the access to worship in church is not simply about legal abilities or disabilities under the law or in the eyes of government, but about who one is. As the protest signs said during this time period, wielded by African American men, I am a man. Do you see the full humanity of people or not? And so the question that rests before the Episcopal Church then, and perhaps it rests with the Episcopal Church now, is where will it go in discerning what the ultimate end is? What is the attainment of access and rights about fundamentally? How deep does that go? How are rights and dignities intertwined with each other? I think there's a lot for us to consider. We're going to stop here, and I hope that our conversations this week will be fruitful.